Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll wait just a moment to let everybody into our Zoom, and then we'll get started with our author tonight, Andrew Nagorski. Thank you all so much for tuning in tonight with the Hudson Library for our virtual author programs. We're so happy to have you with us tonight with our author series with journalist and author Andrew Nagorski. I would, of course, like to thank you, our patrons, for your continued support of our virtual programs. While we can't meet in person and we love to have the authors in our beautiful library, it's so nice that we can still offer the best in programming to you here virtually. We have an exciting lineup coming up of authors. In addition to tonight's author, we have at the end of the week here, renowned food writer Nigella Lawson will be joining us. And next month, I know my colleagues are looking forward to iconic actor William Shatner will be joining us virtually for a discussion about his new book. And we have a lot of upcoming author programs. I would encourage you to take a look at the library's website at hudsonlibrary.org. For all of our upcoming programs, you can register. They're all virtual. Our author programs are all virtual. So you can just continue to watch just as you are this evening, and we look forward to seeing you there. And of course, I'd like to thank our author tonight for his time to share with us a little bit about his new book, Saving Freud. Andrew Nagorski is an award-winning journalist, author, and senior editor at Newsweek International. As Newsweek's Berlin bureau chief, Nagorski provided in-depth reporting about Germany's efforts to overcome the legacy of division, the immigration debate, and German-Jewish relations. He's also reported from Moscow, Warsaw, Rome, and Hong Kong, and is the author of several books, including the bestseller Last Stop, Vienna, Reluctant Farewell, and The Birth of Freedom. Nagorski's latest book, Saving Freud, tells the dramatic true story about Sigmund Freud's last-minute escape to London after Germany annexed Austria. So we are looking forward to hearing a little bit more about your book tonight. As always with our author programs, if you would like to purchase a copy of Saving Freud, copies of the book are available for purchase courtesy of the Learned Owl Bookshop here in Hudson. And we will go ahead and put a link in the chat to the Learned Owl so you can purchase your copy tonight. And as always with our author programs, we encourage you to leave your questions for our author. We'll take questions at the end of the program, but you can put them in anytime during the program in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many questions as we can after we have our conversation tonight. So thank you all so much. And Andrew Nagorski, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thanks. It's great to have you to be on this virtually. And I'm suddenly a little intimidated. I mean, between a master chef and an actor. I mean, this is quite a combination. You got quite a lineup there.
Yes, we do. We do a lot of author programs here at the Hudson Library. And like I said, I'm sure I know my colleagues and I, as well as our patrons, would love that the authors could be here in the building and we'd get to meet these people face to face. But we're happy that we can also still tune in with you virtually. And I think it's given the library a lot more, we've been able to get a lot of people that maybe weren't able to travel for a small town library. We're proud of the series we're able to offer.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So your new book, Saving Freud, just came out in August, the end of August. I think many of us kind of know Freud is a pioneer in the field of psychoanalysis. But your book, when I finished reading it, I kind of felt like your book was a more intimate look at Freud, the person, and not so much his work, but more about his personal life, his family, and also his frailties. I wasn't that aware of this story, and I think it was such an important story to share. Was there anything that, what intrigued you to write the book, or when did you first kind of come across the story, and when did that idea come into your head that you wanted to write a book about it?
Well, it was actually quite late. As you know, I've written several books which deal with this period, the early 20th century, the rise of Hitler, what happened in the Soviet Union, all the upheavals, World War II. So that's been kind of my backdrop. But this is frankly, a new departure for me in the sense that I realize there's a personal story here. And I, like many people, I had this general image of Freud, this rather stern character who smokes his cigars and probably has these people on his couch and offers very cryptic advice. And what triggered this idea was when I was reading the memoir of someone called Robert Zweig, Stefan Zweig, who was an Austrian Jewish author in the beginning of in the 20th century, who was incredibly popular in Austria and all over Europe. He wrote novels, novellas. A lot of them were domestic, almost comedies, but were very incisive social commentaries. And he wrote a memoir before his death in 1942, which incidentally was by suicide. He was in such despair about what was happening in Europe. But he wrote this memoir called The World of Yesterday. And when I'm in between books and looking for what's a good story to follow, I read a lot of memoirs, letters, diaries, and I'm just thinking, is there something there in this rather well-mined area that I haven't heard of that might be an interesting lead? And he described meeting Freud in Vienna, getting to know him a bit. And already he had a portrait that felt more three-dimensional to me than most of what I'd read about Freud. And then Zweig was smart enough to realize as soon as Hitler came to power in neighboring Germany in 1933, that Jews should get out of Austria, and he and his wife got out in 1934. And the next mention in his memoir of Freud is in 1938, after the Anschluss, which was when Hitler took over Austria and incorporated into the Third Reich. And Freud, he mentions how Freud managed to get to London somehow, even though the Nazis were already in power, and his reception in London and basically the last year of Freud's life in London. And I'm thinking, I don't almost nothing about this. How did this happen? Why did Freud, who was so perceptive about the human condition and understood the dangers of the human condition, stick around for so long when Hitler was coming to power, when Hitler took over, until Hitler took over Austria? And then since the Nazis were in power, how did he get out? I mean, that just seemed like an obvious question. It wasn't, by that time, it was both incredibly difficult for Jews to get out of Germany, and Austria had suddenly become part of Germany. And and also many Western nations were not interested at all in receiving Jewish refugees from Germany. So that was my starting point. But then, as you say, I felt, well, to understand him and his psychology, I had to sort of go back and retrace his biography and to understand his state of mind that led to all of that.
Yeah, and in your book, you quoted Leonard Wolfe, that Leonard and Virginia Woolf visited Freud in 1939. And I think it really conveyed what you were trying to say in your book, was that Wolfe said, he gave me a feeling of great gentleness, but behind the gentleness, great strength.
Yes.
Like I said, I think your book really conveyed that about Freud. You could see that he was a gentle person in the way he approached his patients and his family, and he cared deeply for his daughter and those friends that were imperative in helping him get over to London. But you also saw Freud in his role as a very strong person that didn't really want to let go of his identity in Vienna, and even risked almost his life by not willing to leave early enough.
Yes, he was all of those things, and he was also profoundly human. He was someone who had understood, I think, a lot of the dark forces at work on the European continent at the time, and yet, like all of us, he could delude himself a bit, because by the time this last part of the drama is taking place, he's an old man. When Hitler takes over Austria, he's 81 years old, almost 82. He's had cancer of the jaw for 15 years. It's gone through multiple operations. And the other thing is, he was a man who was really wedded to his habits. He was a revolutionary in terms of his thinking. His ideas about the subconscious, the sexual urges, and all this were scandalous to many people. But in his own life, he had the same routines every day. He was married to one woman all his life, 53 years, Martha Freud. He had 6 kids, and he had his rituals about when the barber who had to come and make him, properly look proper for his patients, as any good Austrian doctor would be. But at the same time, he did have these principles, and he did have this idea that he wouldn't be pushed around. And that's, you see from his very early youth. There's a story. Remember, Freud, of course, is Jewish, from a Jewish family. He's not a believer, and he's not observant. But he, as you say, he never rejects his identity. And the more Jews are persecuted, the more he feels like a Jew, he says. And there's a story early on where he asked his dad, for instance, have you encountered anti-Semitism and personally? And his father said, well, there was this time I was walking in the street in Vienna, and somebody just shouted something anti-Semitic at me and knocked my cap off into the gutter. And the man who did that told his dad, pick up that cap. And Freud, the young Sigmund, asked his father, so what did you do? And his father says, I picked up the cap. And Sigmund is mortified. He feels later, when he becomes older, he's more understanding of why his father may have behaved that way. But at the time, he's mortified. And so when the few times when he confronts real anti-Semitism, he stands up to it and doesn't back down. But at the same time, Vienna was a place when he was growing up, when it was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, where Vienna was a very multicultural, multilingual place, and Jews were about 10% of the population, and many of them really did very well.
I think the beginning of your book, it's really an intriguing story about, I think you said, it's no exaggeration that Vienna shaped both Freud and Hitler.
Yes.
And Hitler really only spent about 5 years of his life in Vienna. But I think the part of the story that's so interesting is Hitler's early life as an artist.
Yes.
And how he was kind of overly confident that he was going to get into this prestigious art school,
Yes.
breeze right through the exams, and he ended up being rejected. Admittedly, I've never looked at Adolf Hitler's art before, and I, of course, was curious, like, wow, they deemed his art as unsatisfactory. I wonder what it looks like. And looking at it, it's really remarkable to even think that came from Hitler. They're all like very serene watercolors of landscapes, and it's kind of like a little bit mind-blowing to think that came from Hitler.
Yeah, they're technically not bad. They just didn't feel that this was up to standards. He
Right.
qualified. You had to qualify, submit some of your art to even sit for those exams, and he qualified. But as you say, Hitler always had this exaggerated sense of self, which manifests itself so many ways. And so he was totally stunned when, during the exam, and they had to sit down and actually perform art on demand, they deemed it unsatisfactory. And I'd say, if I had a grudge against one university admissions committee, I'd see that would be the one I'd have a grudge against. Imagine if Hitler had been accepted. Who knows how his life would be? It's one of the things, I mean, I say that somewhat facetiously, but not completely. It's one of the things that intrigues me about this whole period is the kind of the what ifs, that so many things didn't have to turn out the way they did, and people made choices and people didn't make choices, or things happened to people almost randomly, and it could have changed the whole course of history. And there was Hitler and Freud in the same city. Of course, they didn't cross paths literally as far as we know. And as you say, Hitler was there a shorter time, but so Vienna was a city where, well, high culture, high art, and much of it Jewish. And at the same time, it was a lot of very virulent anti-Semitism was stewing among a lot of, I'd say, what we call the down and out elements of the city. And Hitler, who had very little money and was at a loss and felt rejected, and all his grievances were built up from all appearances, that's where his really worst anti-Semitism got going.
But your book, while it's a biography of Sigmund Freud, I think it's also a portrait of the people that were instrumental in helping him save his life. So it's really like not just a biography on Freud.
Yes.
And some of the people that you talked about in your book, of course, his youngest daughter, Anna Freud, was with him through all of this, and was instrumental in helping Freud get safely to London. And one thing that was kind of interesting to me, and I don't know if you have done any research on this in your process of writing, but and you talked about how he and Martha had been married for 53 years, only one spouse. Martha to me kind of seemed like as his wife, kind of just in the background, and it seemed like Anna and Freud really had this connection. Did you get that sense when you were researching?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think the bond between Martha and Freud and Sigmund was very strong at first, and he actually, if you remember, one of the things that comes across from his letters, and by the way, one of the great resources for someone like me writing a book like this, he wrote letters all the time. Mm-hmm. And when he was courting Martha, which was for 4 years, because they had agreed, they were engaged, but he felt he didn't have the money to start a family or even to move out of his family's apartment. And she was near Hamburg, he was in Vienna. They wrote hundreds of letters, and you see his mentality, and so he was really smitten. But then Martha was a very practical person. Her oldest son, Martin, once said, when we had all these family outings in the Alps and so forth, she did all the organizing, and it was as if she was suddenly a member of the Prussian military staff, boom, boom, boom. It wasn't that she was just not over, she was very dedicated and sentimental, but she saw it as her role to keep this complex household and office going and support her husband, who she recognized was really making major breakthroughs, and that her role was, a very traditional role. And in this sense, again, Freud was very traditional. He believed that was a relationship in marriage, and she was particularly comfortable about that, even though Freud was surrounded by women who were completely non-traditional. These are some of the friends you mentioned. Mm-hmm. That while Anna, from a very early age, was fascinated by his work. At age 14, she was sitting in on some of the discussions of him and his colleagues, and she became, of course, a very noted psychoanalyst herself. And then she also, because she was the only child who did not marry and stayed at home all the time, mm-hmm. Even though she then later developed a very close relationship with a woman from the United States, Dorothy Burlingham from the Tiffany family, Charles Tiffany, the Tiffany Company. That's a whole subplot there. But she stayed, and she was intent on helping him professionally. She began to represent him when he was no longer as able to go to, say, party to do large gatherings. And she also helped him with his health and nursing him through the many operations. So yes, there was his relationship with women in the family and outside the family. It's fascinating. But as you say, this is it's Freud's at the center, but it's a group portrait, and it's also the other reason I did the book is these people who were around Freud, who built up this dedication to him, which eventually led them to organize his escape, were incredible. I mean, take any one of them.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. Anna Freud, I mean, I've taken psychology classes in college and stuff, and I don't remember hearing about Anna Freud.
Mhm.
And she really, I think like other women, there are other women in history that kind of were overshadowed by a spouse, a sibling, or someone, you know, like I'll just say like all the Hemingway wives. They each had accomplishments of their own, but the fact that they were married to Ernest Hemingway was their identity. Or, you
Yes.
know, even Mileva Merrick, Einstein's wife, was never really credited with helping with the E=mc², but she
Mhm.
was an accomplished scientist, mathematician herself. I think Anna Freud kind of falls into that as well. She contributed a lot of her own ideas to the study of psychoanalysis, but when we think of Freud, we don't think of Anna Freud. We think of Sigmund
Well, I
Freud.
think in the field, though, she is known. She became such an eminent child psychoanalyst in that field of child psychology. She became well known. And for instance, when they went to Britain, and after her father died, of course, he was such an overshadowing figure. But she and Dorothy Burlingham started a special clinic for kids traumatized by the Blitz, the German bombings in London. That clinic, which is now the Anna Freud Clinic, still exists in London today. Of course, it's gone through various permutations. So, but yeah, you're right. Any sibling or child of a famous person, no matter how accomplished, finds it hard to get out of that shadow.
Yeah, I think probably one of my personal favorite people in your story was Marie Bonaparte.
Yes.
She
Yeah.
she probably could have her own biography and more. She seemed like such a important presence in Freud's life, but also her as a princess, she had the money and the basic connections to help Freud get to freedom. But she
Yes.
had such an interesting story. I think you were talking about at one time when the Freuds were being, when their apartment was, when the Gestapo were coming in to search their apartments, Marie Bonaparte was sitting on the stairs in her fur coat, kind of watching over the family. It's just kind of, she seems like such an interesting person that I
Yeah. I
would
mean,
love
she
to
was
hear
one.
more about.
Right, right. Well, first of all, just for anyone who doesn't know, Bonaparte name, of course,
Yeah.
Napoleon Bonaparte, that's no accident. Napoleon Bonaparte was the brother of her grandfather. So she was the grandniece of Napoleon. So that in itself is a pretty impressive
Yeah.
family calling card. Then, as a young woman, she's married off. She's in this. Her mother has died. Her father is trying to marry her off, and she's married, paired up with the Prince of Greece and Denmark, and so she becomes the Princess of Greece and Denmark. But she's living in Paris. It's sort of a rather distant marriage, and she has, let us say, a very active sexual life, which, of course, people who were attracted to Freud often had that had that characteristic in common, and then had sexual frustrations, which was why they were first gravitated to Freud. And so, although she had affair after affair and was very open about it, she had never, not to be coy about it, she had always felt that she could not achieve orgasm. And she went to Freud to say, what's going on here? And they hit it off instantly. There was her lifestyle was so radically different than Freud's lifestyle, but Freud came to respect her and she came to respect Freud, and he opened up to her in a way he rarely opened up to people. And what happened, she becomes a psychoanalyst herself. He becomes a major supporter of his movement. Remember, Freud, part of the story of this book also is how Freud turns his approach to psychoanalysis, he even coined the phrase psychoanalysis, into something that would really spread around the world. And in order to do that, for instance, he had his own printing press, the family and the psychoanalytical society. And Marie Bonaparte, who had quite a lot of money, supported it during the Depression when it almost collapsed. And then also, of course, helped pay a lot of the bribes that allowed Freud to leave. But that whole relationship is just fascinating between Freud and Marie Bonaparte. And again, the letters between them are so expressive. And one thing, if it's a hobby horse of mine to say, I kind of pity future writers who are trying to write books like me, in the sense who will be dealing with emails and texts and not these lovely letters written that really reveal so much more and so literary. And Freud was a wonderful writer, by the way. I mean, it comes across, he's so expressive. And the way he expresses himself verbally also. Okay, it's also he has an amazing dry sense of humor about a lot of things that comes across. For instance, once he became famous, he rocketed from this unknown person who was seen very suspiciously by the medical establishment to a kind of a superstar. Famous people wanted to meet him, as you say, Leonard Wolfe, but more famously in this case, Virginia Woolf, and the writer. But in 1927 or 1926, Einstein comes to see him. And you have this scene of Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud meeting. Freud was on a visit to Berlin, where Einstein was living at the time. And afterwards, someone asked him, well, what was it like? What was the meeting? And he says, well, I know as much about physics as he does about psychology. So it's a very pleasant meeting.
If I'm sure you have, because it seems like for your research you looked at a lot of primary sources for your book, but the Library of Congress has a digital collection of Princess Marie Bonaparte's papers, and in that collection there are about it looks like 15 years of telegrams and cards and letters back and forth from Bonaparte and Freud, which I'm sure would be really, I think a lot of them were written in German, so I don't know if they've been translated, but
Freud, Marie Bonaparte spoke German.
Okay.
I mean, she was multilingual.
Yeah.
She was French by nationality, but she spoke German. And it's interesting also, others like, for instance, Ernest Jones, who's a character, he's a Welsh physician who becomes the main proponent of psychoanalysis in Britain and then really in the English-speaking world. He, as a young, just out of medical school, started reading Freud before Freud's works were translated, and he knew some German. He got a tutor to learn German so that he could read Freud in German. But wow. Your point about the Library of Congress, as it turns out, the whole Freud collection, the biggest collection of his correspondence and everything, is preserved there, which may seem a little odd, but Freud had a lot of American supporters. And after his death, they determined that they were going to preserve what they could, and then they began accumulating it. And Marie Bonaparte was still alive, and then she sent her stuff there. So the biggest collection of primary sources is right there.
Interesting. Yeah, I know. I remember from reading in your book, you had mentioned that she would go through Freud's trash and make sure that there wasn't anything. She was dedicated to keeping his legacy alive.
Well, that was particularly when they were already under the gun trying to get out of Vienna. And so Freud was they knew he couldn't take everything. So he was just tossing some stuff. And she would go back through and say, no, not this, not that. And again, to speak to her personality, she had diplomatic immunity because she was a princess of Greece and Denmark, and she used the Greek embassy in Vienna as her base. And she was, when this whole frantic period was where the Nazis are harassing Freud, and it looks like it's not sure at all whether he'll get out, she is smuggling some things from the apartment under her skirt every day, and including the little works of art that he loved, these Egyptian, Greek, Roman statues, which most of which, by the way, are preserved in Freud's house in London, which was his house for the last year of his life. And because eventually they got most of this out, remarkably, not just Freud and his entourage, but even that famous couch, where Freud's patients sat, you can see it in London. The apartment and office in Vienna is also a museum, but there are fewer original objects there.
Interesting. So I know you've traveled a lot in your career. Were you ever able to see any of that in London?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, in fact, I mean, I as a foreign correspondent, I lived in Europe a lot, but until I started this project, I was not that intent on, I'd been to London quite often. And I only, while doing this project, went to London. In fact, I was there a month ago and looked again and looked at that house very carefully. It's a beautiful house in Hampstead, this area where a lot of psychologists live and academics. And Freud had one son who was an architect who really made sure that it met his set of specifications and had the feel an awful lot like the apartment in Vienna, so that he could spend whatever time he had left in surroundings that felt very, very comfortable.
Mm. Yeah, I think that was very evident in your book that while his health was failing, his mental capacity wasn't. He was still very much, alert and aware of what everything was going on, and that was definitely not anything of decline. But he was very private about his health condition as it as he was getting older, and it was getting a little bit more, I think I read he had like 33 surgeries on his jaw and had a prosthetic jaw.
Yes. Oh, it was horrible. I mean, he went through agony, trying not to show it. But as you say, he tried to be private about it, and he just was determined to keep working as long as he could. But he also, one of the other characters in my book, most of the characters who helped him out are aside from Anna Freud, are foreigners, including William Bullitt, who was the American ambassador in France and who had been his patient, and then collaborated with him on a book about Woodrow Wilson, whom they both despised. That's a whole nother subject. But and then you have Ernest Jones, this man from London. But his doctor was Max Schur. He was a much younger Jewish doctor in Vienna who was actually recommended to Freud by Marie Bonaparte, who had consulted with him and said, this doctor who actually attended your lectures at the University of Vienna, even though he did not go on to become a psychoanalyst, is a wonderful man, and you're having all these problems and you're dealing with different doctors. You need one doctor to orchestrate all this. And Max Schur tended to him, but one of the really touching moments, I think, is when Freud decides, okay, I'll talk to this young man, sure, and see whether to take him on. He likes him. They immediately strike it up. But Freud says, I have one condition. You have to make one promise to me. If I'm your patient, when the pain gets too bad for me, you'll help me end it when I tell you to. And Schur says yes. And he's his doctor for 10 years. And he actually, Max Schur, again, is like some of the other Austrian Jews who realized early it's getting very dangerous. And already in 1937, he managed to get visas for his family to go to the United States. But he refuses to go until as long as Freud is still there, even in putting himself and his family in jeopardy. He was determined to see Freud, to see to that moment when he would have to make good on that promise. And that would happen only in London, a little over a year after Freud escaped. So it's just, and I think all of these relationships speak to the fact that Freud, who, as mentioned, comes across from the distance as somewhat cold and detached sometimes, was incredibly warm and inspired this kind of loyalty and dedication and all the things that had to happen for him to get out. Which here we are, the first day that Hitler comes into Vienna, literally to make a speech, and it's just a short walk away from the Freud's apartment. These Nazi thugs are invading the apartment, the press operation, and yet Freud still manages to maintain some presence of mind to, for instance, after this first day when they rampaged through the apartment, and Martha and Anna Freud have managed to basically buy them off by pulling out all sorts of money, and then these thugs who are still somewhat disorganized say, we'll come back, and they leave him alone, and they sit down, and Anna says to her father, and she's really despondent, shouldn't we all commit suicide? And he says, why? Because they want us to? And the message is, no, we are not going to give in to these guys. In fact, it was everyone else who he could not be a very active participant in his own, or the arranging of his own escape. But everybody else, he inspired them to do that, to stand up, to make sure he got out and that they all got out.
You talked about how Freud kind of had his own kind of sense of humor, not really sense of humor, but the one thing that kind of was interesting is that when there was a group of students that were burning books by authors that the Nazis hated, Freud's first impulse was to make light of the situation. And you quoted him saying, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Nowadays, they are content with burning my books."
Yeah, well, that doesn't sound very funny anymore.
No.
I mean, and
No,
obviously, but it was his attempt. He would try to diffuse these situations whenever he could. And obviously, at that point, nobody could imagine what was coming, not even Freud. We all tend to think, I think one thing that's come across to me in doing the research for this book and previous books is how easy it is to judge things in retrospect and to say, oh, I would have known, and I would have understood where this is all going. Well, if you put yourself in the position of people at the time, it's by no means so clear. And as a foreign correspondent, for instance, I reported from what was still then behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union, Communist Europe. And we all knew that things at some point we kind of assumed would have to break and something new would come. But to say, I knew when and how, no way. And I think we all tend to get, especially when there's danger, there's a natural tendency to say, well, yes, there are bad things around, but my life won't change. And that's in small and little ways. And Freud was as fallible about that as anybody else. But he could also, the famous, he could also in some of these situations, I think it helped him cope and the people around him cope to have this humor. And there's that famous moment where when they finally negotiate with the Nazis to give him permission to leave, they bring to him a declaration, and somebody from a Nazi bureaucrat brings him a declaration saying, oh, they knew that Freud was such a famous person, and they still, at that point, the Nazis wanted to give the impression that they weren't barbarians. And so they had him, they gave him this declaration saying, oh, I was treated very well by the new regime. They never bothered or harassed me. And he knew he had to sign, otherwise they wouldn't let him go. And he signs it. And as he's signing, he just turns to this guy who comes in and says, oh, and can I add that I hardly recommend the Gestapo to anyone. Of course not. His housekeeper was there, and she almost fell through the floor. The Nazi official just bolted out the door and didn't say anything. But he used humor in so many different ways, and it could be directed against people, for people, but it was something he was he had a good ear for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, love to take some audience questions. I'm sure we have some of our attendees tonight that would love to ask you something. I guess I will wrap up my questions here with great discussion tonight and learning more about your book and this heroic effort to get Freud to safety. But what is it that you hope readers take away from your book?
I think, well, first of all, because Freud is such a well-known figure, I think it always helps to humanize people, to just not put them because somebody's a famous person, you sort of see them as almost a statue. I hope readers will come away from my book with a sense of him as a full human being, with all the failings and but of course incredible accomplishments. No matter what psychologists today think about Freudian theory, that's not what it's like. They say we won't go beyond that. Well, a lot of the original ideas that we take for granted today about the subconscious human sexuality, he introduced all that. Now, many people have gone in different directions with it, but he got it going. But the other thing is about, I think, the fallibility of people in what we were talking about in understanding their own situation. And I would challenge anybody who thinks they know what they would do if they had been living under Nazi occupation or even, for instance, in the Soviet Union under Stalin, that you would have understood everything that was happening before it all happened. And that's even before you get to the moral questions, what would I have had the courage to do? That's an even tougher question. And that's something I contemplated in one of the reasons I wrote a previous book called Hitlerland about Americans in Germany in the 20s and 30s, was, again, not Hitler's history in retrospect, but how they saw things and understood things or failed to understand things then. And when you do that, I think you do become a little less judgmental about people and human events, and just trying to understand them. Just like Freud eventually came to understand his father better, even though he thought he was shocked by what he heard initially.
Absolutely. Do we have any audience questions? Let's see here in my Q&A. Okay. Barbara asked, did the rest of the Freuds family escape with him?
Well, that's a very good question. And he got out with his wife, his sister-in-law, and the couple of his kids who were in Anna.
The Hudson Library will be closing in 15 minutes at 8 p.m.
And he managed to get out some kids, grandkids, and then close friends, some relatives, this whole entourage. But 4 of his sisters, he had 5 sisters. He was one of seven kids. He was the oldest. One sister had and her husband had left for the States already at the end of the 19th century, and he became a very famous, really the father of public relations in the United States. But 4 sisters were living in Vienna when all this was playing out. And for whatever reason, and I go into this into the book a bit, they did not leave. Probably they thought they were lower profile and did not need to leave. And Freud left them money for their survival. But they were still, again, this is in retrospect, it seems, didn't they realize the danger? Who knows? Or maybe it was also that there was not time to go through all the bureaucratic hurdles and bribery of the Nazis to get them out. For whatever reason, they did not leave. And after they left, and the anti-Jewish violence escalated in Germany, Freud was very worried about them, and Marie Bonaparte tried to get them out but failed. And all 4 of them died in the Holocaust, in the camps. 3 in the gas chambers, as far as we know, and 1 of starvation. So this also gets to the point that some people say, well, Freud was too famous. Nothing could have happened to him, even if he had stayed. No, with a regime like the Nazi regime, fame was not protection either.
Debbie asks, where can we read the letters from Freud and Bonaparte? The Library of Congress has the collections are digitized online, and it's just www.loclibraryofcongress.gov.
But
and
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if your German is good and you can read handwriting that's a little difficult, it is from the last century, do that. But assuming most people are not in that position, luckily, a lot of these letters have been translated, and there are volumes, there are various collections of Freud's letters. If you just even go into one of the search sites, Amazon, Libris, anyone, and look for Freud's letters, you will find, for instance, a whole collection of letters between him and Ernest Jones, this British psychologist who you came very close with. There are some of his letters with Marie Bonaparte, with William Bullitt, this American diplomat who plays a big role in all of this. So a lot of it, I mean, takes some searching, and I have various volumes, big and small, a lot of them out of print, but I got to say, I'm can be a bit of a Neanderthal when it comes to new technology, but boy, do I appreciate the fact that I could sit at home and eventually track down stuff that would have, in an earlier age, taken me endless hunts around libraries and rare bookshops and so forth to find long out of print. But some have been reproduced, so you can read a great deal if you just do, plug in Sigmund Freud letters.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Alan asked, did the Gestapo ever try to track or obtain Freud from London?
No, there's no evidence that they did that. I think at that point in the regime, there was also, and since also Freud was not a threat to the regime once he was out, because he was not, as he said himself, he was not a political person. He did not make political declarations. He was preoccupied with his own works. He wrote some essays like Civilizations and Its Discontents, which very clearly denounced totalitarian movements, whether they were of the right or the left, the Nazis or the communists. But he was not one to be signing petitions and being on picket lines. So the Nazis had other things to worry about, and I think that was not their priority.
Do you have any other questions for our author this evening? Okay, we have one coming in here. Did Freud adapt well to London? Was he accepted there as well?
That's a very good question. And in fact, Freud had resisted exile because he was so wedded to Vienna. But as a young man, he had visited London. He had his father, by a previous marriage, had two much older sons there, and they were in Manchester. He visited, and when he visited, I think he was about 19 at the time, he wrote to a friend that if I had to live any place outside of Vienna, I can imagine living in England. And there's something about this place, even though there's a lot of boredom, drunkenness, fog, rain, but there's something in the temperament of the people that I like. And he was impressed by the fact that that Britain had a Jewish prime minister, Disraeli, in his lifetime. He felt it was more tolerant than in Central Europe. And so he felt, and he finds kind of the slow and formal rhythm of life, one that suited him in many ways. This was a guy who every morning had a barber come in and trim his beard and mustache and straighten his hair and made sure his suits were just right. He reminded me, I have a Polish grandfather who was not that far apart in age from, well, of course, a bit younger, but also a product of that kind of an upbringing. When he stayed with us, he would never come down for breakfast in anything but a suit and tie. You just didn't do that. And so in London, he felt right. And when he gets there, he's suddenly treated like this huge celebrity, of course, which he was. But in Austria, people were more circumspect about showing it. When he arrives, the train arrives, there are people all over welcoming him. There are people writing letters to him, seeking his autographs, sending over food. And then this procession of celebrities. We already mentioned Virginia and Leonard Wolfe, but H.G. Wells, Salvador Dali, it goes on and on, who want to meet Freud. And he remarked, well, for the first time, I'm famous. Well, it wasn't really for the first time, but it was so more openly so. And he loved the house he was in, the garden. He said it feels a little bit like the summer place they used to rent just outside of Vienna. And at one point he turns to Ernest Jones, who helped get all these permits to let them into London, into Britain, which was quite a remarkable feat in and of itself. He said, "Yeah, I almost feel like saying Heil Hitler, because he forced us to come here." Yeah, again, his sort of double-edged humor. But he enjoyed London, and Martha Freud really liked it. And she lived much longer than Freud. She lived for almost a decade longer, as I recall, and until she was 90 or so. And she also immediately became very comfortable and did her own shopping and tending of the garden. Very British things, universal, but somewhat felt very much at home there. So London turned out to be, if he had to spend his last year in exile, there couldn't have been a better place. And you get that feeling when you walk through the Freud's house in London even today.
Barbara asked, how long did Freud live after arriving in London?
He lived for 15 more months. When he came, there are even a few very short clips of him. He's still moving around reasonably well. And there's a photo section in my book. There's a picture of him with his doctor, Max Schur, and he looks still okay, but he's already at that point, he's 82 years old. And then the last few months, in 1939, he arrives in London in the beginning of June 1938. So it took him about 2.5 months to get him out of London, out of Vienna. He comes to London, and then he lives there for about 15 months. When the last few months, the pain is becoming excruciating, and he asks Max Schur, his personal doctor, to end it, and Schur does that. I'll leave readers to see how it happens, but it's something done as a great act of love.
All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions from our audience, I just want to thank everybody tonight for tuning in with our author tonight, Andrew Nagorski. Again, if you would like to purchase a copy of Saving Freud, you can purchase a copy through the Learned Owl Bookshop. There is a link in our chat to get your copy this evening. And Andrew, thank you so much for your time. Your book was phenomenal. 5 stars on Goodreads. It was my rating.
Thank you.
I'm excited to read more on the Hitlerland. I think that sounded really interesting, and I am certainly looking forward to what you have coming up next.
Thank you. If I only knew what I had coming up next, but thank you.
Right. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. Have a lovely evening. Good night.
Good night.